When a seasoned officer arrests a man he views with suspicion, he thinks it's routine. But as the man's true identity emerges, the officer realizes he's made a grave mistake. Now, his entire career and his sense of self hinge on a single decision that could change everything. Before we start this story, comment below where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out. On a quiet, shadowed street in the heart of the city, Officer Rick Thompson drove slowly, scanning the dimly lit sidewalks from behind the wheel. The night felt heavy, settled over the city like a weight pressing down, and Rick was already in a foul mood. He'd been stationed on night patrol for the third week in a row, a job he considered thankless and far beneath his years of service. The neighborhood was one he knew well, though he didn't particularly like it. In his eyes, it was trouble. The kind of place where people stayed out too late, where anyone standing around after dark probably had a reason he'd prefer not to know. As Rick cruised down the street, his headlights swept across a tall, well-dressed man standing by the side of a sleek black car. The man, who looked to be in his 50s, was alone, leaning casually against his vehicle with one hand holding a phone to his ear. Rick frowned, his mind quickly jumping to conclusions. It didn't sit right with him. An expensive car, late at night. A man just standing there as if he owned the place. To Rick, the sight seemed suspicious, as though this stranger were up to no good, even though he appeared calm and poised. Deciding he would get to the bottom of it, Rick pulled over, his vehicle's flashing lights reflecting off the quiet street. Stepping out, Rick straightened himself, put on the air of authority he wore so well, and walked toward the man. The stranger glanced over, acknowledged him with a polite nod, and returned his focus to his phone. Rick felt a spark of irritation. It wasn't the kind of reaction he was used to. Most people in this part of town were quick to look down or explain themselves in his presence. But this man looked unbothered, too confident, almost like he knew something Rick didn't. Rick cleared his throat loudly, demanding the man's attention. "Good evening, sir. May I ask what you're doing out here?" Rick's tone was curt, borderline hostile, as if he expected trouble. The man ended his call calmly and looked at Rick with a polite but unreadable expression. "I was waiting for assistance. My car broke down," he said, his voice calm and smooth, betraying no sign of nerves or agitation. Rick didn't like the man's calmness. It seemed too deliberate, too practiced, as though he didn't fully respect Rick's authority. "Really?" Rick scoffed, looking the man up and down with a skeptical eye. "Waiting for assistance, huh? In this area? At this hour?" The man nodded, unruffled by Rick's hostility. Rick's irritation deepened. He hated it when people looked at him like this, as if he were some rookie cop trying too hard. Rick felt the need to establish control, to show this man who held the power here. "What's your name?" Rick demanded, his voice a bit sharper. The man looked at him thoughtfully, a faint smile playing on his lips. "David," he replied. "David Carter." Rick narrowed his eyes, studying the man's face carefully as though the name alone held some hidden meaning. "David Carter, huh?" he echoed, his tone dripping with suspicion. The name didn't sound familiar, but something about the man's composed demeanor nagged at him, making him feel oddly defensive. Still, he brushed off the feeling, chalking it up to irritation at having his authority so casually disregarded. "Well, David Carter," Rick continued with a smirk, "people don't usually hang around on these streets unless they're looking for trouble, especially not people dressed like you." His gaze flickered over David's tailored suit, the polished shoes, the quiet confidence in his posture. In Rick's experience, that kind of appearance in this neighborhood was a rare sight. "So you're just out here, waiting for help," Rick repeated, voice dripping with disbelief. "Seems like a strange choice." David kept his gaze steady, neither intimidated nor defensive. "I apologize if I'm causing you concern," he said smoothly. "I called for assistance. They're on their way. I didn't think waiting here would be a problem." He held Rick's gaze calmly, and for a brief moment there was something in his eyes. a flicker of recognition, a hint of restrained authority. But it passed too quickly for Rick to catch. Rick's fingers twitched, itching to assert control. The way David spoke, the polite tone, the careful choice of words, the quiet strength in his voice, grated on him. It was as if this man thought he was above Rick, above the situation, untouchable. Rick's irritation sharpened into something nastier, fueled by a sense of being challenged. He wasn't about to let this David Carter get away with an attitude like that. "Look, Mr. Carter," Rick said, letting his voice harden. "This isn't a neighborhood where people can just hang out waiting for help." He took a step closer, sizing David up. "You're not from around here, are you? What kind of business do you even have in this area?" David's calm didn't waver. "I was passing through. I didn't expect my car to break down." There was a slight pause, as if he were choosing his next words with care. "But I'm familiar enough with the area to know it isn't unsafe." Rick's jaw clenched. That hint of confidence, that almost veiled assurance, didn't sit well with him at all. He knew that tone. It was the tone of someone who thought they had nothing to fear, someone who thought they knew more than they let on. And Rick hated it. Rick felt a surge of annoyance mingling with something harder to define, a sense of unease, maybe even intimidation. But he shook it off. This guy needed to understand who was in charge here. "Well, I don't care where you were passing through or what you think you know," Rick snapped. "This isn't your neighborhood, and I'm not seeing any good reason for you to be out here." His gaze dropped to David's hands, noting they were relaxed, resting casually by his sides. It felt wrong, the calmness, like he was somehow mocking Rick without saying a word. "Hands where I can see them," Rick demanded, his tone sharper, almost daring David to refuse. But David didn't react with the defensiveness Rick half expected. No hesitation, no worry, just a mild compliance. He raised his hand slightly, a faint look of patience on his face. That look bothered Rick even more. It was the look of someone waiting for the inevitable, someone confident that they could handle anything thrown at them. And Rick felt his authority slipping with every second of that silent, steady gaze. Frustrated, Rick stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the difference in their heights, could see the calmness in David's eyes up close. "You're not taking this seriously, are you, Mr. Carter?" Rick's voice was low, carrying a thinly veiled threat. "Maybe you're used to people giving you a free pass, but out here, things work a little differently." David looked at him thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "Officer," he began in a measured tone, "I understand you're doing your job. I've told you who I am, and I assure you there's no need for—" Rick cut him off. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he barked, the words sharper than he intended. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, slipping into something deeper, something he hadn't expected. The way David spoke, the careful choice of words, the measured tone, it felt like he was being assessed, like he was the one on trial. Rick's frustration was spilling over, twisting his perception. "All right, that's it," Rick said, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're coming with me, Mr. Carter. Let's see if you stay this calm back at the station." He grabbed David's wrist, pulling his arms behind his back. David didn't resist, but there was a moment as the cuffs clicked shut, where Rick felt David's gaze on him, steady and unwavering. There was no fear, no anger, just something quietly intense, a calm that cut deeper than any protest. David's voice was barely above a whisper as Rick tightened the cuffs, but there was a hint of warning in it. "Officer," he said, "are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Rick scoffed, dismissing the subtle warning in David's tone as arrogance. "Oh, I'm sure," he sneered, gripping David's shoulder a bit harder than necessary. "We'll sort this out at the station." He led David toward his patrol car, ignoring the subtle looks of surprise and curiosity from a couple of passers-by who had slowed down, drawn by the sight of the well-dressed man being taken in cuffs. As he secured David in the back seat, Rick couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something. There was something unnerving about David's calm, the way he seemed almost unaffected by the whole situation, as though he were merely observing rather than experiencing it. Rick got behind the wheel, feeling a strange itch of doubt, but determined to ignore it. He told himself this was just another arrest, another late-night patrol gone routine. But deep down, he knew this wasn't routine at all. The silence in the car felt heavier as they drove. Rick occasionally glanced at David in the rearview mirror, expecting a flicker of frustration or fear, some sign that his calm exterior was cracking. But David simply gazed out the window, seemingly unbothered, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights. His expression was almost serene, even as they neared the station. This attitude, this quiet confidence, gnawed at Rick's nerves. Every second of that silence felt like it mocked him, like David knew something he didn't, and Rick felt the tension building in his own chest. After a few minutes, David finally spoke, his tone still even, polite, but with an edge that made Rick grip the steering wheel tighter. "You know," David began, "I understand that this might seem unusual to you, but I'd encourage you to think carefully about the assumptions you're making right now." His voice was calm, the words calculated, and for a moment Rick wondered if he was missing something important. But Rick hardened his expression, shrugging off the doubt. "You don't get to lecture me, Mr. Carter," he shot back, gripping the wheel tightly. "You're in my car, under my authority. We'll see if you're still talking like this once we reach the station." His own words felt hollow to him, and he hated that. Hated that this man, restrained in the back seat, had managed to rattle him so deeply. David merely nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand, but remember, officer," he said in a tone so calm it sent a chill through Rick, "not everything is always as it appears." The rest of the ride passed in tense silence, Rick growing increasingly uncomfortable, though he'd never admit it. He couldn't shake the eerie calmness that clung to David, a quiet assurance that seemed to defy the situation. When they finally pulled up to the station, Rick felt a rush of relief. He was back in his domain, surrounded by familiar walls and the authority he wielded daily. Here, there would be no room for David's strange, unsettling calm to unsettle him further. Rick led David out of the car and into the station, his grip firm on David's arm, more for his own sense of control than anything else. As they entered, a few officers glanced up, their faces shifting from curiosity to something more uncertain. Some of the younger officers exchanged glances, and one of the senior officers, Lieutenant Garcia, raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised to see David in cuffs. "Thompson," Garcia called out, her tone cautious, a question unspoken in her gaze. "Who's this?" There was a note of hesitation in her voice, her eyes flicking to David with something bordering on recognition. But Rick, still driven by his need to assert control, brushed it off, ignoring the slight tension spreading through the room. "Just someone who thought he could ignore the rules," Rick replied with a smirk, steering David toward the processing area. But Garcia didn't move, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked from Rick to David. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then paused, studying David's face, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly as something clicked. "Officer Thompson." David's voice interrupted smoothly, his tone controlled and even. "I think you might want to listen to your colleagues here." His gaze flickered to Garcia, acknowledging her recognition, and a faint knowing smile played at the corner of his mouth. Rick felt his patience snap, frustration boiling over. He didn't care what his fellow officers thought. He had this situation under control. "Save it," Rick muttered, steering David into the holding area, ignoring the unsettled glances from the other officers around him. But his grip on David's arm faltered slightly as he saw Lieutenant Garcia start to follow them, her expression now serious, even concerned. Inside the holding area, Rick directed David to sit, securing him to a bench while he started the routine processing procedures. As he filled out the paperwork, the silence grew unbearable, the quiet tension thickening with every glance Garcia threw in their direction. Rick avoided looking directly at her, feeling his own irritation twisting into something close to doubt. Rick forced himself to focus on the paperwork, the routine procedures, anything to avoid the unsettling looks from Garcia and the others. He scrawled David's name across the intake form, with a little more force than necessary, but his hand stilled when he reached the section for occupation. He hadn't bothered to ask and didn't care to. With a slight huff, he left it blank, muttering under his breath, "Not like it matters anyway." As he handed the form over to the processing officer, he caught a glimpse of David seated calmly on the bench, watching the room with that same unbreakable composure. David's eyes followed the movements of each officer, as though he were familiar with every inch of the place, every routine, every protocol. Rick's irritation flared again. This man didn't just act calm. He seemed in control, almost as if he were evaluating them. Before Rick could make another move, Lieutenant Garcia approached, her face tight with a blend of worry and urgency. She leaned in close, lowering her voice so that only Rick could hear. "Thompson, you need to be very careful right now," she murmured, her eyes flickering toward David. "Do you know who this man is?" Rick bristled, refusing to let any doubt show. "Yeah, I know who he is. Another guy who thinks he's above the law," he replied, dismissing her concern with a wave of his hand. But Garcia's face remained tense, her expression growing more serious by the second. "No, Rick, I don't think you do," she said, her voice dropping further, a hard edge now cutting through her tone. She took a steadying breath. "That's David Carter, the new police commissioner." For a moment, Rick's mind went blank, the words failing to register fully. He blinked, struggling to process what she'd just said. "What are you talking about?" he whispered harshly, disbelief sharpening his tone. His gaze shifted slowly, almost unwillingly, to David, who was watching him with that same calm, assessing look. It was as though he'd been waiting for Rick to realize, waiting patiently for this exact moment. "Yes, Commissioner David Carter," Garcia repeated, her words heavy, deliberate. "He was appointed just last month. I thought everyone here knew." Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head, an incredulous look in her eyes. "Didn't you see the memo?" Rick felt a cold sweat creeping down his spine, disbelief and panic starting to rise within him. The weight of what he'd done, the condescending words, the handcuffs, the dismissive treatment, crashed over him in a sickening wave. He had arrested the new police commissioner, dragged him through the station like a common criminal, and every smug word he'd uttered replayed in his mind like a series of brutal, incriminating echoes. David met Rick's gaze steadily, his expression unreadable but his eyes carrying a hint of something that looked suspiciously like disappointment. Rick's throat went dry, and his heart pounded as the reality of his actions settled in. He'd made a colossal mistake, one that could cost him his career, maybe more. Panic twisted in his gut, but he fought to keep his expression steady, not wanting to show weakness in front of his colleagues or, more crucially, in front of Commissioner Carter. He turned back to Garcia, a look of desperation flickering in his eyes. "Lieutenant," he began, trying to keep his voice low and controlled. Maybe we can smooth this over? I mean, there's got to be a way to handle this without—" His voice faltered as he glanced over at David, who was still sitting calmly, his hands resting in his lap, watching the scene unfold with unsettling composure. Lieutenant Garcia shook her head slowly, her expression laced with frustration and disbelief. "Rick, this is beyond smoothing over. You handcuffed and arrested the commissioner. Do you have any idea what that means?" She looked at him, a mixture of pity and disappointment in her eyes. "You didn't even recognize him?" Rick swallowed hard, a weak attempt to gather himself, but he knew it was useless. The room seemed to close in around him, every pair of eyes watching, every breath laden with the silent judgment he knew was coming. He opened his mouth, scrambling for some kind of explanation, but no words came out. How could he justify this? That he'd jumped to conclusions? That he hadn't bothered to ask questions or check the man's credentials? Finally, David spoke, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over the room. His tone was calm, but held a quiet authority that instantly commanded attention. "Lieutenant Garcia," he said, nodding slightly in her direction before looking back at Rick, "I think Officer Thompson and I need a moment alone." The request hung in the air, and for a brief second, Rick thought Garcia might argue, might try to intervene on his behalf, but she simply nodded. giving him a look that held both sympathy and caution before stepping back, signaling the other officers to clear the area. The room emptied slowly, leaving Rick alone with the man he had so thoroughly misjudged. As the door clicked shut behind the last officer, Rick felt his pulse quicken, every nerve on edge. He looked at David, who was watching him with that same steady, piercing gaze, and for the first time he felt completely exposed, as though every flaw, every bias, every crack in his facade had been laid bare. David took a slow breath, the silence stretching between them, heavy and almost unbearable. "Officer Thompson," he began, his voice measured, each word deliberate. "Do you have any idea how many lines you crossed tonight?" Rick swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. He could barely meet David's gaze, but he forced himself to look up, nodding slightly as a weak attempt at acknowledgement. The weight of David's words, the quiet intensity in his tone, made Rick feel smaller than he ever had before. He felt like a rookie again, exposed and unprepared, standing in front of a man who could dismantle his career with a single word. Rick stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I didn't know. If I'd known who you were." David raised a hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. "That's precisely the problem, Officer Thompson," he said, his voice still calm, yet carrying a quiet force that stopped Rick cold. "It shouldn't matter who I am, whether I'm the commissioner, a fellow officer, or just an ordinary man on the street. You made assumptions, judgments, without any basis beyond what you saw." His words cut deep, each one landing with a precision that left no room for excuses. Rick felt the truth of those words sink in, piercing through his defenses. He wanted to argue, to explain, but he knew any attempt would only sound hollow. The truth was, he had acted on instinct, on bias, without a second thought. And now he was standing face to face with the reality of what that meant. David continued, his gaze unwavering. "When you approached me, you didn't see a citizen in need of help. You saw a problem, someone you believed didn't belong. You didn't ask questions, didn't consider the possibility that you might be wrong. Instead, you asserted authority that wasn't earned, and you used it recklessly." Rick felt a chill run through him, shame flooding his chest. He wanted to look away, to avoid David's piercing gaze, but he couldn't. He owed the man that much, at least. He owed him his attention, his humility. David took a step closer, and Rick felt the quiet power in his presence, a calm authority that had nothing to do with titles or rank. "You're supposed to be a protector," David said, his voice softening slightly, though his gaze remained sharp. "That badge is meant to stand for trust, respect, and integrity. Tonight you showed none of those things. You treated me with suspicion not because of my actions, but because of my appearance." Rick's face burned with humiliation, but David's tone left no room for pity. It was the kind of straightforward honesty that stripped away every defense, leaving only the truth. And Rick knew deep down that every word was deserved. "I could file a formal complaint," David continued, "and that would be the end of your career. I don't think you understand how serious this could be for you." There was a pause, heavy and filled with possibility. Rick's heart pounded as he awaited David's next words, feeling as if his entire future hung on this moment, on the commissioner's decision. But David simply looked at him, his expression softening just a fraction. "But maybe," he said, after a pause, "you need something else instead of punishment. Maybe you need a chance to reflect, to understand what it truly means to serve and protect, not just enforce." Rick's mouth opened slightly, a mix of shock and relief flooding through him. He hadn't expected mercy, hadn't even dared to hope for it. And yet, here it was, offered to him in a way that felt both humbling and strangely redemptive. Rick stood there barely breathing, his mind reeling from David's words. The unexpected mercy left him feeling unsteady, stripped bare by both the shame of his actions and the surprising generosity of the commissioner's response. He felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, guilt, and a deep, gnawing sense of inadequacy. For the first time, he truly understood how profoundly he had erred. David held his gaze, allowing a moment of silence to pass between them, letting the weight of his words sink in fully. Then he spoke again, his tone softer, but still carrying that unshakable authority. "You're going to be given a new assignment, Officer Thompson," he said, effective immediately. Rick's heart skipped a beat, panic flaring once again. A new assignment? He thought of all the possible repercussions, all the roles within the department he might be relegated to, and his stomach twisted. But David's expression remained calm, steady, giving no indication of what this new role might entail. "You're going to work in community outreach," David continued, watching Rick closely for his reaction. "I want you to spend time with the people you're supposed to be serving. Listen to them, understand their lives, their struggles, their experiences, and in doing so, I hope you'll come to realize the weight of the badge you carry, not just as a symbol of authority, but as a mark of responsibility." Rick felt a lump form in his throat, realizing that this wasn't the punishment he'd expected. It was something much deeper, something that would require him to confront his own assumptions and biases. Community outreach was a role he had always looked down on, dismissing it as soft work, far removed from the real police work he'd taken pride in. But standing here, face to face with the man he'd wronged, he realized that this was exactly what he needed, and perhaps what he deserved. David continued, his voice quiet but firm. "This assignment is not a demotion. It's an opportunity, one that many officers would benefit from. I expect you to take it seriously." He paused, letting the significance of his words sink in. "I'll be checking in on your progress, Officer Thompson. Don't waste this chance." Rick nodded slowly, feeling the gravity of David's words settle within him. "Thank you, sir," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't have the words to express the depth of his remorse, nor the strange sense of hope that had blossomed amidst his shame. For the first time in his career, he saw a path toward becoming not just a better officer, but a better person. David gave a slight nod, signaling that their conversation was over. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Rick, his gaze thoughtful but resolute. "Remember, Officer Thompson," he said, his voice calm yet powerful. "Respect isn't something you're owed. It's something you earn." And with that, Commissioner David Carter walked out of the room, leaving Rick standing there alone, his mind racing with the impact of those final words. Rick stood in the empty room for a long moment, David's words echoing in his mind, each syllable carrying a weight he hadn't fully grasped before. Respect isn't something you're owed. It's something you earn. The truth of it struck him deeply, making him painfully aware of how he'd been operating, expecting obedience, enforcing authority without earning trust or understanding. Now the realization felt like a bitter pill, the kind that sticks in your throat, refusing to go down smoothly. As he made his way out of the room, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some watched with curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment, as if they knew a version of what had just transpired. Lieutenant Garcia met his gaze, her expression a mixture of sympathy and reproach, and gave him a slight nod as if to say, "You got lucky." Rick managed a small, stiff nod in return, knowing her look was justified. Back at his desk, he sank into his chair, his mind reeling with the events of the past hour. He'd thought he understood what it meant to be a cop, to uphold the law, to keep the peace. But now, he felt he was standing on completely unfamiliar ground, as though everything he knew about policing had been tilted off its axis. Community outreach, the assignment left him feeling exposed, as though his flaws were on display for everyone to see. Yet, beneath the discomfort, there was a flicker of something else, something unsettlingly close to hope. A message pinged on his computer. It was a notification of his reassignment, officially transferring him to community outreach under a new supervisor. He stared at the screen, rereading the words, feeling the reality of it settle in his chest. He wasn't going back to the beat, to the familiar routines and the comfortable feeling of authority he'd once taken for granted. He was being given a second chance, but it would come with challenges he'd never considered. As he sat there, processing his new reality, Rick felt an unexpected pang of gratitude. Despite his own pride, his mistakes, and his biases, David Carter had chosen not to end his career but to teach him a lesson, one that he felt in his bones would change him if he allowed it to. For the first time in years, Rick didn't feel like an officer with authority, but a man with a lot to learn. And as daunting as it seemed, he knew this was his only way forward. He took a deep breath, the weight of the experience settling around him. Tomorrow, he'd walk into that new assignment, not as the Officer Thompson he'd been, but as a man who, maybe for the first time, was ready to truly serve. The next morning, Rick arrived at the community center, feeling a mix of nervousness and reluctance he hadn't felt since his first days on the force. The center was already bustling with activity, parents bringing in kids, volunteers setting up tables, and a few familiar faces from the neighborhood eyeing him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Rick adjusted his uniform, feeling strangely out of place in it here, where the rigid lines of authority felt softened by the warmth and vibrancy around him. He was greeted by Officer Emily Vargas, a young but experienced community officer, known in the department for her empathetic approach and deep connection with the people in this part of town. She extended a hand, her expression kind but professionally distant. "Welcome to Community Outreach, Officer Thompson," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I'll be your supervisor here, so we'll be working closely together." Rick nodded, trying to shake the unease from his voice. "Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity." The words sounded hollow to him, like he was reading from a script, but Emily simply gave him a polite nod, as if she understood. "Today, I'm going to introduce you to some of the community leaders and residents," she said, gesturing toward the main hall where people were gathered talking in small groups. "These are the people we serve every day, and you'll be working directly with them, hearing their stories, addressing their concerns." Her tone held no judgment, just a steady professionalism that felt both welcoming and intimidating. Rick followed her through the hall, feeling the weight of curious stares from the community members. It was clear that many of them knew who he was, or at the very least knew the type of officer he had been. He could see it in the cautious glances, the way conversations quieted slightly as he passed. He couldn't help but feel exposed, as though every assumption he'd ever made about this neighborhood, every preconceived notion, was now laid bare for them to see. They stopped in front of a small group gathered near a table covered with pamphlets and coffee. Emily introduced Rick to the group as Officer Thompson, who will be joining us here in community outreach. One of the women, an older resident with a warm smile but a penetrating gaze, nodded at him and said, "Good to meet you, Officer Thompson. We hope you're here to listen." Her words were simple, but the unspoken message was clear. She wanted to see if he was truly ready to change. Rick felt a flush of embarrassment but managed a nod. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to listen," he replied, the sincerity of his words surprising even him. As he looked around at the faces surrounding him, he saw the cautious hope and guarded skepticism in their eyes. He felt, perhaps for the first time, that he wasn't just representing the badge but standing as himself, with a lot to prove. Emily continued with the introductions, explaining the various programs the community center ran, from youth mentorship to neighborhood watch meetings. As Rick listened, he found himself struck by the complexity and depth of each initiative, by the care and dedication that went into supporting the lives of the people here. It was a world he had never bothered to understand before, a community he had once dismissed in his own narrow view of what policing meant. By the end of the day, Rick felt both exhausted and strangely humbled. The people he met, the stories they shared, the work they put into creating a safe and supportive environment for each other. It was nothing like the assumptions he had carried with him for so long. He realized now how much he had missed, how much he had misunderstood. And as he left the center that evening, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that maybe, through this work, he could earn the respect he once believed was his right, and become the kind of officer David Carter had challenged him to be. Over the following weeks, Rick settled into his new role, though the transition was anything but smooth. Each day felt like a new challenge, a test of patience and humility. He spent mornings sitting in on community meetings, listening as residents voiced concerns about everything from street safety to housing issues. Initially, he found it difficult to sit quietly, to resist the urge to correct people's perceptions or justify his past actions. But he soon realized that this wasn't about him. It was about them, their lives, their fears, and their trust. One afternoon, Rick joined Officer Vargas on a visit to a nearby school for a mentorship session with a group of teenagers. The kids were wary of him, glancing at him with mistrustful eyes, their skepticism almost tangible. Rick knew why. He'd been the kind of officer they'd learned to fear and avoid, the one who saw them as trouble waiting to happen, rather than kids with their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. Now, seeing that mistrust directed at him, he felt the weight of his past actions, the barriers he himself had built. Emily took the lead, engaging the students in conversation, asking about their interests and goals. Slowly, some of them opened up, talking about their ambitions, their worries, and their frustrations. Rick listened, humbled by their honesty. One of the boys, Jamal, eyed Rick for a long moment before speaking. "Officer Thompson, can I ask you something?" Rick nodded, feeling the tension in the room shift as everyone waited for his response. "Of course, Jamal, go ahead." The boy hesitated, glancing down before meeting Rick's gaze. "Why did you become a cop?" The question was simple, but it felt loaded, carrying with it the weight of distrust, hurt, and maybe even a hint of hope that there was something more to the uniform. Rick took a breath, grappling for an honest answer. He thought back to when he'd first joined the force, fresh out of the academy, eager to make a difference. But somewhere along the line, that idealism had faded, replaced by cynicism and assumptions, and he'd lost sight of the purpose that had driven him. "I became a cop because I wanted to help people," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "But I lost track of what that really meant. I stopped seeing people for who they were and started making assumptions. And I was wrong to do that." He paused, feeling the vulnerability of the admission. "I'm here now because I want to change that. I want to learn how to help people in the right way." Jamal nodded slowly, the guarded look in his eyes softening just a bit. Around the room, the other kids seemed to relax, some even offering him small, tentative smiles. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, a crack in the wall that had once separated him from the community he'd served with blinders on. After the session ended, Emily approached him as they walked out of the school. "You did good today," she said, a note of approval in her voice. "They can see you're trying." Rick managed a small smile, feeling a glimmer of pride, tempered by humility. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, like he was starting to understand what it truly meant to serve and protect. It was a long road, he knew that, but for once he was ready to walk it. One careful, deliberate step at a time. As Rick's days in community outreach continued, he found himself slowly gaining the trust of the people around him. Each day he became more immersed in their lives, their stories, and their struggles. He learned things that surprised him, like how many of the residents volunteered to keep the neighborhood safe, or how a group of mothers had organized a nightly patrol to protect their children from gang influences. The more he listened, the more he understood the resilience and strength within the community he had once misjudged. One evening, during a neighborhood meeting, Rick sat quietly in the back, watching as residents discussed concerns over a recent spike in vandalism. They spoke passionately about wanting to protect their neighborhood, but he could hear the underlying frustration in their voices, frustration toward a system that had often overlooked them. After a while, one of the men, Carlos, turned his attention toward Rick, his expression challenging but earnest. "Officer Thompson," Carlos said, addressing him for the first time since he'd started attending the meetings. "You've been sitting in on our talks for a while now. You're here to help, right? His question held a tone of expectation, as though he were ready to test if Rick's presence was more than just a symbolic gesture. Rick felt the weight of the room's attention turn to him, and he took a breath, aware of how much his answer mattered. Yes, he replied steadily, looking directly at Carlos. I'm here to help, but I also know that I've got a lot to learn. I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers, but I am here to support you all in any way I can. Carlos nodded, still watching him closely, as though measuring his sincerity. Good, he said after a moment. Because talk's cheap, officer. We've had plenty of officers promise to help us and nothing ever changes. What makes you different? Rick felt a pang of guilt, knowing he was only beginning to understand the depth of their mistrust, their disappointment with law enforcement. I can't change the past and I can't undo the mistakes I made, he said honestly, but I can start by listening, by showing up, and by working alongside you. I want to be someone you can trust, and I know I have to earn that. The room was silent for a moment, each person processing his words. Finally, a few heads nodded, and Carlos offered him a small, reluctant smile. It wasn't acceptance yet, but it was a sign of something shifting, a tentative bridge being built. As the meeting wrapped up, Carlos approached Rick privately, his expression softer. You know, we've been waiting for someone to actually listen to us, he said. It's going to take time, but maybe we'll give you a chance. Rick nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. That's all I'm asking for, he replied, a chance to prove that I'm here for the right reasons. And as he shook Carlos's hand, he felt a genuine connection, the beginnings of a bond he hadn't thought possible when he'd first arrived in community outreach. That night, as he walked back to his car, Rick realized that for the first time, he felt like he was part of something real. Not just a uniform, not just a badge, but a true partner to the people he had once misjudged. It was a small step, but it was one he intended to build on, brick by brick, with every honest action he could offer. In the following days, Rick threw himself into the work with a determination that surprised even him. He joined neighborhood cleanup efforts, volunteered at youth events, and met with families to discuss safety concerns and improvement ideas. Slowly, he became more than just the officer sitting in on meetings. He became a familiar face, a trusted presence that people began to seek out. He was beginning to feel like he was finally doing real, meaningful work, not just enforcing rules, but actually helping build a stronger, safer community. One afternoon, during a break between meetings, he found himself talking with Mrs. Johnson, one of the older residents who had lived in the neighborhood her entire life. She was known for her sharp wit and a seemingly endless supply of advice, both wanted and unsolicited. As they sat on a bench outside the community center, she turned to him, her eyes filled with a kindness that caught him off guard. You know, Officer Thompson, she began, when you first started coming around here, I didn't trust you one bit. I thought, here's another officer who's just passing through doing his time before he moves on and forgets about us. Rick nodded, feeling a twinge of regret. He couldn't blame her for feeling that way. He had, after all, been that kind of officer before, blind to the real needs of the people he was supposed to protect. But, she continued, giving him a thoughtful look, I've seen you working, really working, and I can tell you're trying. You're not just here because they told you to be. She paused, a smile creeping into her eyes. You're here because you want to be. I can see that now. Rick felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, mixed with an unexpected sense of pride. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson, he replied softly. That means more than you know. I came here thinking I'd be doing something for all of you, but I think I'm the one who's learning the most. She laughed, patting his hand in a gesture both motherly and approving. That's what it's about, officer. We all have something to learn, and sometimes it's the ones we least expect who teach us the most. As he walked back into the community center, her words echoed in his mind. He realized that he'd been given a rare opportunity, one that was helping him change in ways he hadn't thought possible. He wasn't just here to repair the damage of one night's mistake. He was here to transform the way he viewed the community, his role as an officer, and even himself. Later that evening, as he was packing up to leave, he noticed a small group of teenagers gathered outside. One of them the same boy, Jamal, who had questioned him that first day at the school. They were talking, laughing, their energy light and unguarded. Rick hesitated, feeling a sudden impulse to approach them, to offer some acknowledgement of the progress he hoped they were seeing. As he walked over, Jamal noticed him and nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Hey, Officer Thompson," he greeted him, his tone less guarded than before. "Hey, Jamal," Rick replied, nodding in return. "I just wanted to say, thanks for giving me a chance. I know I didn't make it easy to trust me." Jamal shrugged, his smile widening slightly. "Yeah, but people can change, if they really want to." He glanced at his friends and they all nodded in agreement, some even offering Rick their own small smiles. Rick realized in that moment that the bridge he was building wasn't just with individuals, but with an entire community. The weight of his responsibility felt different now. Not a burden, but an honor. As he watched the teens walk off, laughing and joking, Rick felt an unfamiliar yet welcome feeling settle over him. Belonging. And with that feeling came the quiet conviction that he was exactly where he was meant to be. In the weeks that followed, Rick's presence in the community became a fixture. He was no longer the outsider, the officer with a badge who patrolled at a distance. He had become integrated, someone the residents began to wave to on their morning walks, someone the kids would approach with questions or just to share their day. He felt, for the first time, like he was truly part of their lives, and the realization left him both humbled and grateful. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a warm glow over the neighborhood, Rick was approached by Carlos, the community leader who had challenged him during his first meeting. Carlos looked thoughtful, almost hesitant, as he signaled for Rick to join him on a short walk down the street. They walked in silence for a while, the hum of the city around them. Finally, Carlos spoke, his voice carrying a seriousness that caught Rick's attention. "You've done good work here, Officer Thompson," he began, glancing sideways at Rick. "People are talking, they trust you, and that's not something we hand out easily." Rick felt a surge of gratitude but held it back, sensing that Carlos wasn't finished. "But," Carlos continued, "you should know that trust isn't just about what you do here with us. It's about what you're willing to do when things get tough, when it's not easy to stand by us." He stopped, turning to face Rick directly. "We need someone who will stand up for us, who will speak out when things aren't right, even if it means going against his own." Rick understood immediately. Carlos wasn't just talking about the work he'd done so far. He was challenging him to go further, to be someone who would fight for the community from within the police force, someone willing to bridge the divide and advocate for their needs and rights. Rick nodded slowly, letting the weight of Carlos's words settle over him. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not just here to make amends for my mistakes, Carlos. I'm here because I want to be the kind of officer who stands for what's right, even when it's not easy." Carlos studied him for a moment, then nodded, a look of respect crossing his face. "Good. Because we need that. We need more officers who see us, who listen to us, who fight for us. You've already proven yourself to us, Rick. Now you just have to prove it to yourself." The two men shared a handshake, a gesture that felt as solid and lasting as the trust Rick had worked so hard to earn. In that moment, Rick understood that this wasn't just a temporary assignment or a step toward redemption. This was his purpose, a calling that had been waiting for him to rise to it. As they parted ways, Rick looked out over the neighborhood, feeling a renewed sense of duty and determination. He was no longer just a visitor or an outsider. He was a part of this community, and he would carry their trust with him wherever he went. He would be their advocate, their protector, their ally, and he would do it with the kind of integrity and respect he had only recently come to understand. And with that commitment in his heart, Rick knew he was ready for whatever came next, knowing that, for the first time, he was not just a cop, but a true servant of the people. In the following days, Rick found himself stepping into this new role with a profound sense of commitment. His days were spent not only with the community but also within the department, where he began noticing the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, biases he had once taken for granted. He heard the dismissive remarks, the casual stereotypes passed around, and he saw officers like his old self, who saw this neighborhood through a lens of suspicion rather than understanding. At first, Rick struggled with how to address it. He wasn't yet sure if he had the standing to challenge his fellow officers, especially after his own recent transformation. But as the days passed, he felt a growing sense of responsibility to speak up. The community had placed its trust in him. He owed them his voice. One day, during a briefing, a young officer made a comment about keeping an eye on the neighborhood Rick had come to know so well. The words were laced with an all-too-familiar condescension, a tone that implied judgment without real understanding. Rick felt a spark of anger flare up, and before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Maybe instead of just keeping an eye, we could take some time to actually get to know the people there," he said, his voice calm but firm. The room fell silent and all eyes turned toward him, some surprised, others curious. The young officer scoffed, giving Rick a skeptical look. "Since when did you become the neighborhood advocate, Thompson?" Rick took a deep breath, his mind racing with everything he'd learned and experienced over the past few months. "Since I realized that real policing isn't about patrolling from a distance," he replied. "It's about building trust, understanding people, and treating them with the respect they deserve. If we can't do that, we're failing them, and ourselves." A few officers exchanged glances, some nodding slightly, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable. But Rick didn't back down, his gaze steady as he continued. "I've spent time there, and I've seen how resilient, how resourceful, and how supportive that community is. They want to work with us, not against us. But it's up to us to make that partnership happen." There was a moment of silence, and then, to Rick's surprise, Lieutenant Garcia spoke up. "Officer Thompson's right," she said, her tone supportive and resolute. "We have to be more than just enforcers. We have to be collaborators, allies. That's the only way we make real lasting change." The tension in the room began to ease, and Rick felt a surge of gratitude for Garcia's support. He knew it wouldn't be an overnight transformation. That change would be slow, sometimes met with resistance. But he also knew that, with each small step, he was helping to reshape not only his own perspective, but those of the people around him. As the meeting wrapped up, several officers approached Rick, some with cautious support, others simply curious about his experience in the community. He realized that, for the first time, his voice had made an impact beyond the neighborhood. He had begun to bridge the gap between the two worlds he was now a part of, forging a path where understanding and trust could grow. And as he left the precinct that evening, he felt a quiet pride, knowing that he was becoming the kind of officer he had once only aspired to be. A true advocate, a leader, and above all, someone who valued the people he served above his own authority. The journey was far from over, but Rick was ready, step by step, to continue building that bridge. As the weeks continued, Rick's commitment deepened, and he found himself navigating between two worlds. The community that had come to trust him, and the department he was working to change from within. His days were filled with conversations that challenged him, situations that tested his resolve, and small but meaningful victories that reinforced his purpose. He was often exhausted, but for the first time, fulfilled in a way he hadn't known was possible. One evening, after a long day at the community center, Rick was invited by Jamal and a few of the neighborhood kids to join them at a local basketball game. The invitation caught him by surprise, as he knew that trust from Jamal and his friends had been hard-earned. It was a small, almost casual gesture, but it meant everything to Rick. Accepting with a genuine smile, he found himself walking alongside the group, listening as they talked excitedly about their favorite players, strategies, and the local team's chances. At the game, Rick was just another face in the crowd, laughing, cheering, and sharing in the energy of the community. It was an experience that felt worlds away from his former life as an officer watching from a distance. Here, surrounded by people he had once misjudged, Rick felt at home, accepted as part of something bigger than himself. There was no barrier, no badge separating him, just shared joy and connection. As the game went on, Carlos and a few other community leaders approached Rick, nodding in quiet acknowledgement of his presence there. They exchanged stories, talking not only about neighborhood concerns but also sharing parts of their lives that Rick hadn't known before. They laughed, reminisced, and spoke openly, their bond now something more than professional. They had become friends, allies in a shared mission to build something lasting. At one point, Carlos leaned over, looking at Rick with a smile that held a hint of pride. "You know, Thompson, I never thought I'd see the day when you'd be right here with us, a part of all this. It means a lot." Rick felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of validation that went deeper than he could express. "It means a lot to me too, Carlos," he replied, his voice sincere. "I finally get what it means to be here for the right reasons. This isn't just my job anymore. It's my responsibility, my commitment." The game ended, and as the crowd filed out, Rick found himself surrounded by familiar faces, handshakes and smiles, the kind that only came from people who had seen his growth firsthand. As he walked home, he felt the depth of his transformation, the person he'd become through every lesson learned, every relationship built. But Rick knew his journey wasn't complete. He had begun to change perceptions within the department, bridging the gap one conversation at a time. There would be days ahead that would test him, days where he'd be reminded of the biases and prejudices that still ran deep, both in others and, sometimes, still within himself. Yet he was ready, more prepared than ever to continue his path. He had become not just a police officer, but a community member, a voice for the people he served, and an advocate for change within his department. And as he looked up at the stars that night, he felt a sense of purpose and belonging that he knew would guide him, reminding him that he was exactly where he was meant to be. A few weeks later, Rick found himself invited to a formal community council meeting, an event where local leaders gathered with city officials and a handful of officers to discuss long-term initiatives for neighborhood safety, youth programs, and community police relations. This was the first time Rick had been asked to represent the community's perspective to city officials, and the weight of the invitation wasn't lost on him. He arrived early, greeted by familiar faces who had once looked at him with distrust, but now offered warm smiles and nods of encouragement. Carlos introduced him to the council members as our officer, and Rick felt a swell of pride and responsibility. He was there not as an outsider, but as a representative of the people he'd grown to care for deeply. As the meeting began, various topics were addressed: proposals for more lighting in certain areas, funding for after-school programs, and the need for job opportunities for young adults. Rick listened intently, taking notes, absorbing the priorities of the community leaders. Then, as the conversation turned to law enforcement, one of the city officials, a man who clearly had little familiarity with the neighborhood, started discussing ways to control crime, his language laced with subtle but unmistakable stereotypes. Rick felt a flicker of anger, but he steadied himself, reminding himself of the responsibility he now bore. When the official finished, Rick raised his hand to speak and the room fell silent, all eyes on him. "Thank you for your thoughts," Rick began, choosing his words carefully. "But I think it's important that we consider an approach that builds partnership rather than control. I've spent the past few months in this neighborhood, and I've seen firsthand that the people here are incredibly resilient, supportive, and resourceful. They don't need to be controlled. They need to be supported and respected." The official looked taken aback, but Rick pressed on, his voice steady and confident. "If we want real safety and progress, we need to focus on building relationships, investing in youth programs, and listening to the people who live here. Policing isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about being present, being accountable, and earning trust." A murmur of agreement passed through the community leaders, and Rick saw a few heads nodding in approval. Carlos shot him a look of pride, and a few residents gave him discreet thumbs up. For the first time, Rick felt like he was standing firmly in both worlds, as an officer and as an advocate for the community he served. The meeting concluded with a commitment from the city officials to allocate more funds to community programs and to work on implementing Rick's suggestions. As people filed out, several of the council members approached Rick, thanking him for his words, expressing how much it meant to have an officer speak up on their behalf. Outside, Carlos clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "You did good in there, Thompson," he said. "You're more than just an officer now, you're one of us." Rick nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew he'd come a long way, transforming from the officer who had once seen this neighborhood as a problem to be managed, to someone who saw it as a community to be valued and protected. The journey hadn't been easy, but every challenge, every conversation, and every moment of humility had shaped him into the man he was now. As he walked back to his car, Rick realized that he was no longer just working in this community. He was a part of it. He carried their trust and their hopes with him, and he was ready to keep building the bridge between the people he served and the department he represented. And as he looked around at the neighborhood he had once misjudged, he felt a sense of peace and purpose, knowing that he was right where he belonged, ready to keep moving forward, one step at a time. A few days after the council meeting, Rick found himself called into Commissioner David Carter's office. The summons had come unexpectedly, and though Rick knew he had been doing well in his community role, a trace of nervousness lingered as he walked down the hallway toward Carter's office. The memory of his first encounter with the commissioner, that tense, humbling night when he'd made his worst mistake, was still vivid in his mind. As he entered, Commissioner Carter looked up from his desk and offered a nod, gesturing for Rick to take a seat. Rick sat, his posture attentive but relaxed, knowing he had grown in ways that made him both confident and humble. Carter's gaze was steady and Rick couldn't quite read his expression. "Thompson," Carter began, leaning back in his chair, "I've been keeping an eye on your progress. I've heard from Lieutenant Garcia, and more recently, I received feedback from some community leaders. They're impressed, and I have to say I am too." Rick felt a wave of relief and gratitude, his chest swelling with pride. He nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Thank you, sir. It's been transformative, to say the least. I've learned more than I ever expected, and I know I still have a long way to go." Carter smiled slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. "That's exactly the kind of humility and awareness we need in our department, Thompson. Your journey has shown me that change is not only possible but necessary." He paused, then leaned forward, his tone turning more serious. "I called you in today because I believe you're ready for a new responsibility." Rick blinked, the weight of the words catching him off guard. "A new responsibility, sir?" Carter nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, I want you to lead a new initiative within the department, a bridge-building program. We need officers who are dedicated to community engagement, who understand what it means to earn trust and respect. I want you to take charge of this program, train officers, mentor them, and help shift our department's approach to policing." Rick's heart raced. The offer was a profound honor, a sign of how far he had come. He thought of the journey that had led him here, the hard lessons, the humility he'd had to embrace, the trust he'd worked so hard to build. Now, he was being asked to lead others down a similar path, to share what he'd learned, to inspire change from within. "I'd be honored, sir," Rick said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to be part of this change. I know what it feels like to need it, and I know what it can mean for the community and the department." Carter nodded, his expression softening with approval. "Good. I had a feeling you'd say that. Remember, this won't be easy. There will be resistance, and there will be setbacks. But if you can reach even a handful of officers the way you've reached the people in the community, it will be worth it." Rick nodded, feeling the gravity of the responsibility settling over him, but also the sense of purpose it brought. He knew that he was stepping into a role that would challenge him further, but it was a challenge he was ready to accept. He was no longer just an officer with a badge. He was an agent of change, a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to understand each other. As he left Carter's office, Rick felt a renewed sense of purpose, a fire in his chest that fueled his steps. The community had changed him, and now he would work to change others. He was ready to share his journey, his mistakes, his growth, and his newfound understanding with others, guiding them down the path he had walked. And as he walked back through the station, Rick knew that his journey was only just beginning. He was ready, more than ever, to build a future where trust, respect, and true service defined what it meant to wear the badge. In the months that followed, Rick took on his new role with a sense of purpose and commitment that only deepened with each passing day. Leading the bridge-building program wasn't easy. He encountered skepticism, resistance, and even open hostility from a few officers who dismissed his approach as soft or unnecessary. But Rick remained undeterred, drawing on his own experiences to show them the power of connection, of genuine service, and of respect. He hosted workshops, led ride-alongs through the neighborhoods he knew so well, and shared his own story, the mistakes he'd made, the hard lessons he'd learned, and the transformation he'd undergone. He spoke candidly, without glossing over the realities of his own biases and the work he'd had to do to change them. And gradually, the walls began to come down. A few officers started asking questions, opening up about their own challenges, and even joining him at community events, where they could see firsthand the impact of genuine engagement. One afternoon, as Rick was wrapping up a training session, he noticed a familiar face in the back of the room, Jamal, standing with a group of teenagers from the community. He had brought them to the station as part of a youth outreach event Rick had organized, aiming to bridge the gap between young residents and the police force. Jamal met Rick's gaze and offered a small nod, his expression filled with pride and respect. Rick smiled, feeling a surge of emotion as he realized how far they had all come. Jamal, once wary and mistrustful, was now a bridge himself, helping his friends see the humanity in the officers who patrolled their streets. Rick walked over to him, extending his hand, and Jamal shook it with a grin, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. As the room filled with conversations, laughter, and tentative connections between officers and teens, Rick stepped back, taking it all in. He saw Carlos chatting with an officer, Mrs. Johnson animatedly sharing stories with another, and the younger officers listening with genuine interest and empathy. The scene was everything he had once thought impossible, a vision of unity, trust, and mutual respect that he had fought to bring to life. Rick felt a deep sense of fulfillment settle over him, one that went beyond any achievement he had experienced before. He knew there would always be challenges, that change was slow and sometimes fragile. But today, in this room, surrounded by people he had once considered strangers, he saw a glimmer of the future he dreamed of, one where the community and the police could stand together, where the badge truly represented service, trust, and honor. As he walked out of the station that evening, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the city, Rick felt at peace. He had become the officer he'd once only aspired to be, someone who didn't just enforce the law, but embodied justice, compassion, and connection. His journey had transformed him, and now he was helping to transform others. And as he looked out over the neighborhood he had come to call his own, Rick knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, part of something bigger than himself, a bridge between worlds, a servant of the people. He took a deep breath, feeling ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that this was only the beginning of a legacy he was proud to build. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.